The ball stopped before the fence. That's what I told Jonah and Cass that night, and that's what I kept repeating to myself in the weeks that followed. The ball stopped before the fence. I went to get it. There was nothing there. We went home. Clean version. Version that fits in one sentence. The problem is I know exactly what really happened. I needed the exercise. That was Jonah's idea, and he has this infuriating ability to make anything ridiculous sound reasonable when he uses that calm voice of his. Deactivated field, overgrown grass. Nobody's gonna care. We brought the ball in a canvas bag, 3 flashlights, and Jonah brought a thermos of coffee that sat forgotten in the grass the whole time because none of us took a single sip. I remember that. The thermos just sitting there, steam rising from it, and nobody touched it. The Briarwood School field is in the oldest part of Kannapolis, on a block that feels like it stopped in time while the rest of the city kept moving. The school had already closed before I ever knew the place. The chain-link fence is the older kind, with wider mesh, rusted at the joints. You can see the bleacher posts from a distance, those painted metal structures peeling off in strips. The grass on the field hasn't been cut long enough to soak through the soles of your sneakers in seconds. We played for maybe 40 minutes. Cass had been complaining from the start. It was wet. It was late. She'd woken up early. Jonah and I ignored her with the ease of people who've heard those same complaints many times before. She complained, but she stayed. She always stays. The kick was mine. I'm not going to blame the terrain or the tall grass or the angle. I kicked too hard. The ball went wide, sailed over the low fence separating the field from the area behind the bleachers, and disappeared into the dark on the other side. I heard it hit something, concrete probably, and roll. Jonah pointed his flashlight in that direction and said I had to go get it. I went through the gap in the fence. There was a bent section near the corner post, wide enough to squeeze through sideways. My phone's flashlight lit up a narrow cone of taller grass, then cracked concrete, then the concrete side of the bleachers. The maintenance shed sat up against the back wall, a low cinder block structure with a metal door. There was vegetation growing through the cracks in the concrete, those low, creeping plants that show up where nobody walks. I found the ball about 8 yards from the fence opening. It had stopped in the wet grass, near where the concrete begins. I bent down to pick it up. That's when I heard it. It wasn't a growl. I'd expected a growl or anything that sounded like an angry animal, which is what your mind goes to when you're in a dark place and you hear something that shouldn't be there. It wasn't that. It was slower, wetter. A sound of steady pressure with short intervals, like something heavy was being worked at patiently. Chewing, but at a volume I couldn't associate with any animal I knew how to name. I raised my phone. The creature had its back to me, crouching. Not exactly crouching because its knees were bent in a way that didn't look possible. Bent too far, with its long legs touching the ground in a way that felt wrong. It was between the corner of the shed and the tree line that closed off the back of the property. Hunched over something on the ground. Its arms moved with that same slow rhythm as the sound, back and forth, back and forth. The phone's light caught the creature's back for less than 2 seconds before I lowered my arm on instinct, my heart pounding at a speed I didn't know was possible outside of a sprint. The skin was sparse, uneven, visible between the tufts, the color of wet ash. The shoulders were wide in a way that didn't match any proportions I knew. Not wide like a large man, wide in a different way, like the bones underneath had been assembled to the wrong measurements. The head was tilted down, over whatever it was eating. I couldn't see what it was. I saw strands of fur stuck to the concrete near its feet. I saw a dark stain spreading through the wet grass. I smelled it before I saw any of it. Open flesh, metallic, warm despite the cold air. The kind of smell that coats the back of your throat and won't leave when you swallow. On the metal door of the shed there were deep marks in the steel. Not dents, parallel grooves, like something had dragged 4 fingers across it with enough force to bend the metal. I didn't pick up the ball. I turned around and walked back to the gap in the fence. On the other side, Jonah and Cass had their flashlights aimed at the field, waiting. I squeezed through the fence and said, in the most controlled voice I could put together at that moment, "There's something back there." Couldn't get a good look. We need to leave right now." Jonah looked at me, then at the dark behind the bleachers, then back at me. He asked what I'd seen. I said I didn't know. That it was big. That it was eating something. There was a pause. Cass was the first to speak. She said I'd gotten spooked by a possum and that she was going to call me Possum Riley for the rest of the year. Jonah let out a short laugh, the kind that escapes before a person decides whether they're actually going to laugh. But both of them were already moving as they messed with me, grabbing their things, walking toward the exit without anyone needing to say it twice. Cass kept doing a dramatic voice, imitating someone scared of a little animal, but she was walking fast. Jonah said it was probably a big dog or a wild boar, and that it made sense on an abandoned lot like that. Said it in that calm voice of his, but he stayed right by my side the whole way to the car, never drifting. The thermos got left behind. Nobody went back for it. I drove. I didn't say much in the car beyond what was necessary. That night, lying in bed, I kept thinking about a crack in the concrete near where the ball had stopped, with a small plant growing out of the middle, round leaves. I kept thinking about those leaves for longer than made any sense. I think it was just easier. In the morning, I saw in the neighborhood group chat that district workers had found the fence bent and dried blood near the bleachers. The ball was at the entrance to the field, torn in half. I hadn't left the ball there. It was on the other side of the fence when I walked away. Something had come back to the field after us. I didn't tell anyone except Jonah and Cass, and even to them, I'd only told half of it. The version that stayed between the three of us was the smaller version. Something big, probably an animal. Riley got spooked, we left. Jonah texted the next day asking if I was okay. I said yes. Cass sent a short voice message saying she'd looked it up, and that wild boars were common on abandoned properties in North Carolina, and that I could stop being dramatic. I listened to the voice message twice and didn't respond. The problem with the wild boar explanation was simple. I had seen the things back. I had seen the shoulders. I had seen the arms moving. Wild boars don't have arms. But I let the explanation stand. It was easier to let it stand than to open up what was on the other side of it. The news about the fence and the blood circulated in the neighborhood group for about 2 days. Someone posted a photo of the bent chain link, taken from a distance, with a comment about vandalism. Someone else replied that this kind of thing happened all the time on abandoned properties, and that the district should have demolished that school a long time ago. The photo of the fence got 11 comments and disappeared from the feed. Nobody publicly mentioned the torn ball. I kept waiting, but nothing came up. I saw the ball in the photo. It was in the corner, out of focus, but you could make out the shape. Torn in half like someone had jammed their fingers into the seam and pulled. I didn't say anything in the group. I went to work. I did the things I do. I ate at the same place I always eat. That diner on Cannon Boulevard with the green Formica tables and a TV in the corner that's never on the channel anyone wants to watch. I ordered the same thing I always order. Scrambled eggs, toast, coffee. The morning waiter's name is Daryl, and he has this habit of resting his pen behind his ear while he writes down the order even though he knows it by heart. I sat there staring at that pen behind Daryl's ear for longer than made any sense, thinking about nothing related to the field, or trying to think about nothing related to the field. The smell was what stayed the longest. Not constantly. It wasn't like I walked around feeling it all day. It was more treacherous than that. It showed up at specific moments and without warning. At the butcher counter in the grocery store, when I walked past and the guy behind the counter lifted the lid to grab a cut. In the kitchen trash, one night when I'd forgotten to take it out and the heat of the day had done its work. Once, with no reason I could identify, in the hallway at work, in the middle of the afternoon. Just that metallic, warm, wet undertone, rising straight to some part of the brain that bypasses rational thought. When it happened, I breathed through my mouth until it passed. Jonah called me a few days later. Said he'd driven past Briarwood on his way home and they'd put up caution tape at the field entrance, the orange kind the district uses when they're going to do something and never do. He said it in that calm voice of his, like he was telling me about traffic. He asked if I'd seen anything else in the neighborhood group. I said no. He went quiet for a second and then said, "It was a wild boar, Riley. A big wild boar. There are huge boars in this region. I said, yeah, probably. He said bye and hung up. I sat there holding my phone for about 3 minutes after that, thinking that Jonah hadn't brought up the wild boar to convince me. He'd brought it up to convince himself. And the fact that he'd felt the need to call and say it meant he wasn't pulling it off. Cass went off the grid for a week. That wasn't completely out of character for her. She disappears, reappears, acts like nothing happened. But when she came back and we met up for drinks at the bar near her place, she was quiet in a way that wasn't like her. Cass normally fills silence. That night she sat staring at her glass, answering in short sentences, and at no point did she make the Possum Riley joke I'd been sure I'd be hearing for the rest of my life. I asked if she was doing okay. She said she was tired. I didn't push it. But when I left and looked back, she was still in the same spot, glass in hand, staring at the table. That night I looked up large animals in North Carolina. Wild boars, yes. Black bears, yes. But black bears don't sit there eating in the middle of abandoned urban lots. Not like that. There's a type of feral dog that shows up in certain areas. Dogs that lost their owners and went wild and ran loose for a generation or two. I actually read 3 paragraphs about that before I realized what I was doing. I was looking for an explanation that fit what I'd seen. The problem was that what I'd seen didn't fit anything I could find. I closed the browser, went to sleep, woke up at 3 in the morning with that sound in my head. Not the smell this time, just the sound. The wet rhythm, the steady pressure, the regular intervals. I lay there in the dark listening to an air conditioner in my neighbor's apartment, trying to layer that mechanical, steady noise over the other one, which wasn't mechanical and wasn't steady, and which I couldn't stop hearing with a clarity that didn't fade with time. In the neighborhood group, in the middle of that same night, someone posted that a dog had gone missing near the street that runs along the back of the Briarwood property. A photo of the animal, medium mixed breed, tan coat, blue collar. 17 people commented. Nobody found the dog. I didn't comment anything, but I couldn't get back to sleep. I drove past Briarwood by accident. At least that's what I told myself at the time, that it was on the way, that it made geographic sense, that the street running in front of the school cuts about 10 minutes off the drive when traffic on Highway 29 is bad. All of that is true. But I'd sat in bad traffic on Highway 29 hundreds of times before, without ever thinking of that alternative. And this time, I thought of it. It was late afternoon. That yellow light that happens when the sun is low and the air is humid. The kind that makes things look sharper than they are. I eased off the gas without realizing it when the school appeared on the right side of the road. The front fence had the orange caution tape, like Jonah had said. 2 traffic cones at the entrance. One of them knocked over. No patrol cars, no workers, no sign explaining what was going to happen there. The orange tape swayed in the wind in a mildly irritating way, like decorations nobody took down after the party. I should have kept driving. I pulled over onto the shoulder about 20 yards past the entrance and sat there looking through the rearview mirror. From that angle I could see part of the field. The tall grass, the bleacher posts, a section of the inner fence separating the field from the back area. I couldn't see the shed from there. I sat like that for about 2 minutes. Engine running, hands on the wheel, watching through the rear view like that was somehow different from looking directly. That's when I saw that the shed door was open. Not wide open. Ajar at that angle you get when someone pushed through and didn't close it behind them, or left in a hurry. The night we were there it had been shut. I'd seen the marks on it, those parallel grooves in the metal, but it had been closed, flush against the frame. Now it wasn't. There was nobody on the property that I could see. I put the car in drive and left. Not slowly. I left at normal speed. Not rushing, but not stopping again either. I turned on the radio. There was a song playing I didn't recognize. That kind of modern country with electronic production that seems to be trying to be 2 things at once, and ends up being neither. I left it on anyway. I didn't tell Jonah I'd driven past the school. Didn't tell Cass either. It was the next day that Patrice Odom stopped me on the sidewalk. I was parking near the grocery store when she appeared out of nowhere, or not exactly nowhere. She was getting out of an old car 2 spots up from mine, but I hadn't been paying attention. Patrice is the kind of person who always seems to have just arrived from somewhere, and be about to head somewhere else, bags in hand and an air of a packed schedule that doesn't quite match the amount of time she actually takes to stop and talk. She knows me by sight. We say hello when we see each other, the kind of neighborhood relationship that exists in Kannapolis more than in bigger cities. Not friendship, but recognition. She lives on the street that runs along the back of the Briarwood property. I knew that because she'd posted in the neighborhood group a few times over the years, complaining about noise coming from the lot, people sneaking in at night, that kind of thing. She asked if I'd noticed the activity at the school. I said I'd seen the orange tape. She shook her head with the look of someone who expected that answer and wasn't satisfied with it. Said it wasn't about the orange tape. Said a district inspector had shown up to do a walkthrough, a man named Derek, and that she'd tried to talk to him but that he'd been polite in the way people are when they don't actually want to talk. I asked what she'd been trying to tell him. Patrice set one of her bags down on the ground and looked at me for a second, like she was deciding how much of the story was worth sharing with someone she wasn't sure would take it seriously. Then she said that what was going on at that property wasn't new, that before the 3 friends who went in at night, and here she paused for a beat as if she knew I was one of the 3, and was giving me the chance to confirm it, which I didn't. Before that, she'd already been hearing things at night. Not every night, but regularly. Sounds she couldn't identify coming from the direction of the property. I asked what kind of sounds. She said it was hard to describe. Said that one time it had sounded like something heavy moving through the brush at the back. Another time it had been different. Quieter, but in a way that was worse than noise. The kind of silence that happens when something large stops moving but hasn't gone away. I stood there looking at her. She said the dog that went missing wasn't the first. That over time there had been others. Not many, not every week. But enough that she'd started keeping hers inside at night a good while back. Said the neighbors who'd lost animals never connected the dots because nobody connects the dots when things happen with enough time between them. I asked if she'd ever seen anything with her own eyes. Patrice picked up her bag from the ground. Said that once in the middle of the night, she'd looked out her back window toward the property and seen something moving near the tree line, too far away for detail, close enough to not ignore. Said it was large, and that it moved in a way she didn't know how to classify, and that after seeing that she'd closed the window, pulled down the blinds, and hadn't looked again. She said all of this in a completely flat voice, the way someone reports something they've already processed and filed away, something that doesn't need an emotional reaction anymore because the reaction already came and went. Then she said she hoped the district inspector knew what he was doing, said goodbye, and walked off with her bags. I stood in that parking lot for a while after she turned the corner. The sun had dropped further, and the yellow light had turned to that other kind, more orange, the kind that doesn't last. A loose shopping cart drifted slowly into the bumper of the car next to mine, pushed by the wind, and the low metallic sound it made was enough to make me step back before I even processed what it was. I went and did my shopping, bought things that weren't on the list and forgot 2 that were. On the way back to the car, I thought about Patrice saying it wasn't new, that there had been other dogs, that she'd pulled down the blinds and hadn't looked again. I thought about the fact that she hadn't asked if I was one of the 3 friends. She already knew. Jonah called me in the middle of the night. That wasn't like him. Jonah goes to bed early, wakes up early, has a relationship with time that I've always found mildly irritating. The kind of person who texts at 7 in the morning expecting an immediate response and goes dark at 10 at night. When my phone buzzed and I saw his name on the screen, it was almost 2 in the morning. I answered. He didn't say hi. He said, "You went back there." It wasn't a question. I stayed quiet for a second and then asked what he was talking about. He said he'd driven past Briarwood that night late on his way back from somewhere and that he'd seen my car parked on the shoulder in front of the school. He described the car, the position, the approximate time. He was right about all of it. Said he'd pulled over just to check if everything was okay, but that by the time he stopped, I'd already left. I explained that I'd come through that way by accident, that I'd stopped for a moment and moved on. I used the exact same words I'd used on myself. Shorter route, traffic on Y-29. Makes geographic sense. I heard those words coming out of my mouth, and they sounded just as unconvincing out loud as they had in my head. Jonah went quiet on the other end. Then he said, in that calm voice of his that's sometimes reassuring and sometimes the most unsettling thing in the world, "Riley, what did you see back there? Not the short version. What you actually saw. I could have dodged it. I'd done it before and it had worked well enough. But it was 2 in the morning and I'd been carrying the sound of that chewing in my head for weeks, along with the smell that showed up without warning, and Jonah was on the other end of the line waiting with a patience he didn't have to have but did, and so I told him. I told him everything. The shoulders that were wide in the wrong way, the knees bent at an impossible angle, the sparse fur, the gray skin visible between the tufts, the arms moving in that rhythm, the smell, the marks on the shed door, the fact that I hadn't been able to see what the thing was eating, and that some part of me had decided in that moment that it was better not to know. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end. Then Jonah said something I wasn't expecting. He said, "I heard you coming back through the fence." I made him repeat it. He said that night, while I was on the other side getting the ball, he and Cass had stayed on the field waiting. That at a certain point before I reappeared, he'd heard a sound coming from the direction of the shed. Not the sound I'd described. Something else. A sound he said he didn't know how to classify and that he'd assumed was me moving something around on the concrete. But then I'd come back through the fence from the wrong direction to have made that sound. I asked what kind of sound. He went quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Like something heavy shifting its weight. Just once. Like it had turned around." I lay there staring at the dark ceiling after we hung up, thinking that the creature had turned around, that in the moment I lowered my phone and slowly backed away, it had turned around, and that Jonah was on the field on the other side of the fence holding a flashlight, completely visible, and that it hadn't done anything. I couldn't figure out if that was a relief or something else entirely. I went to Briarwood early in the morning, before the street got busy. I didn't go in. I stood outside the front fence with my hands in my pockets, looking through. The orange tape was there, one cone still knocked over. The field was quiet, the grass wet with dew. The bleacher posts with that peeling paint that looks like texture from a distance and like neglect up close. I saw the district inspector before he saw me. Derek Souza was on the side of the field near the inner fence with a clipboard and a tape measure. A man in his early 30s, shoulders rounded from spending a lot of time bent over measuring things, dark cap, a work jacket with the district logo embroidered on the chest. He was photographing the marks on the inner fence with his phone, crouched down, tilting his head to look from different angles. I left before he looked up. I didn't want to answer questions. But mostly I didn't want to see the expression on someone's face as they looked at those marks for the first time, trying to decide what had made them. I already knew what that expression looked like. I'd worn it myself. It was that afternoon that the thing happened that I still can't properly explain. I was at home on the couch, laptop open on my lap without actually using it. One of those situations where the screen is open but you're staring at a fixed point in the middle of the air. The apartment was quiet. Outside there was the normal street noise, a car passing every now and then, the muffled sound of a TV from the apartment upstairs. My phone buzzed. A message from a number I didn't have saved. Just one line. "Did you see what it was eating?" I stared at the message for an amount of time I can't calculate. Read it again. Read it a third time as if the words were going to change. I typed, "Who is this?" No response. I typed, "How did you get this number?" No response. I called the number. It went straight to voicemail, no recorded message, no name, just the standard beep of a mailbox nobody had set up. I sent 2 more messages throughout the afternoon. No response. The next morning the number was out of service, not blocked out of service like a burner that had been activated and shut down. I didn't tell Jonah, didn't tell Cass, but the question stayed with me. Did you see what it was eating? I hadn't. I'd turned away before seeing made that decision in less than a second without thinking, a reflex older than rational thought. And now, for the first time, I was asking myself whether that had been the right call. Whether there was any real difference between not knowing and not wanting to know. Whether the answer to that question would change anything or just make everything heavier than it already was. I didn't reach any conclusion, but I couldn't stop thinking about the question. Jonah disappeared on a Thursday, not dramatically. No missed call, no strange farewell message, no sign that anything had changed. He simply stopped responding. A message I sent sat with a gray check mark for a full day, then 2. On an app where Jonah's messages normally went blue within minutes. I called twice. Voicemail. I sent an email, which is ridiculous. Nobody emails a friend. But I did, and no response came. Cass said she wasn't getting through to him either. She said it in a voice that tried to sound unconcerned and didn't quite manage it. She suggested maybe he'd taken a trip and forgotten to tell anyone, that it was just like Jonah to take off without letting people know. I agreed that it was just like Jonah. But Jonah had called me in the middle of the night to talk about Briarwood, and people who are trying not to think about something don't call in the middle of the night to talk about it. Something had shifted in him over those weeks, and I hadn't been paying close enough attention to know exactly when. I kept trying to remember the last time I'd actually talked to him. Not texted, talked. The late-night call. He'd said he heard the creature turn around. He'd gone quiet after I finished telling him everything. And before hanging up, he'd said something small that I'd let slide at the time. He'd said, "I think I needed to know what you saw." I'd taken it for relief, someone finally knowing the whole story. But now, with his silence stretching into days, I kept going back to that sentence and trying to find another meaning inside it. I think I needed to know, not wanted to know. Needed. As if knowing were necessary for something he hadn't mentioned. Jonah reappeared one morning without warning, the way Cass had predicted. A short message saying he was fine, that he'd been away for a few days, that we'd talk soon. No explanation of where he'd gone, no mention of the silence. We met 2 days later on neutral ground, that park near his place where we sometimes walked without any particular destination. It was my idea. He agreed too quickly, which wasn't like Jonah. He normally suggested an alternative spot, a different time. He had an opinion about everything. He agreed to the first place and time I proposed. When I got there, he was already sitting on a bench near the artificial lake in the middle of the park. That lake has a fountain that runs during business hours and shuts off at night, and it was off. And the water was still and dark with that film of leaves that forms when nobody disturbs it for a while. I sat down next to him. Jonah was different in a way I couldn't precisely name. He wasn't hurt, wasn't agitated, didn't look like someone who hadn't slept. He was quiet in a way that wasn't the comfortable silence I knew from him. It was a denser silence. Like someone carrying the weight of a decision that's already been made and can't be undone. I asked where he'd been. He said he'd needed to step away for a bit, that he was fine. I asked if he'd gone anywhere specific. He looked at the lake for a moment. Then he said he'd slept in his car for 2 nights at a gas station off I-85 near Concord. He said it without any drama, like it was technical information. I sat there looking at him. He said, "I went there, Riley." I didn't need to ask where. He said he'd gone to Briarwood, that he'd gone in through the same gap in the fence, that he'd made it to the back area near the shed. I asked why. He stayed quiet for long enough that a couple walked past the bench pushing a stroller, the baby asleep with white noise coming from a small device clipped to the side. Jonah watched the couple go by. Then he said, "I needed to see if it was real." I asked what he'd found. He said the shed door was open, that he'd gone inside, that the smell inside was strong. He couldn't stay more than a minute before he had to leave. Said that on the concrete floor there were marks that weren't from tools, weren't vandalism, were marks of pressure and dragging that he couldn't classify. That on the walls there were dark stains at irregular heights, some too low to make sense if whatever made them had been standing upright. I asked if he'd seen the creature. He said no, but that as he was leaving the shed, he'd heard something in the tree line at the back. Not a growl, not a branch snapping. The sound of breathing, heavy, slow, steady. At a distance he couldn't calculate because the dark and the dense vegetation wouldn't let him see anything beyond shadow layered on shadow. He said he'd walked out, not run, because he'd been frozen long enough for his brain to push past the panic and arrive somewhere colder on the other side. We sat in silence for a while. Then he said something that stayed with me. He said it didn't come after me. Not as relief, as an observation. As a data point he was trying to fit into some logic, and it wasn't fitting. He said he'd thought about that the whole way back to the car, that the creature had been there, close enough for him to hear it breathing, and it hadn't come, hadn't investigated, hadn't moved toward him, or at least not in any way he could detect. I asked what he thought it meant. He looked at me in that direct way Jonah rarely used. He said, "I don't know, but I don't think it means we're safe." I left the park before dark. On the way to the car, I passed the park trash can, and the smell of the garbage in the heat, meat, organic, metallic, stopped me for a second in the middle of the path. I closed my eyes, breathed through my mouth until it passed. When I got home, there was a message from Cass saying she needed to talk to me and Jonah, that it was important, that she didn't want to do it over text. I didn't respond right away. I sat in the kitchen with my phone on the table, staring at Cass's message, thinking about what Jonah had said. It doesn't mean we're safe. And thinking about what he hadn't said, but what was implicit in all of it, that he'd gone there alone in the middle of the night without telling anyone, and that part of the reason he hadn't told anyone was that he knew it was a bad idea, and he went anyway. That Briarwood was doing this to us, pulling us back, that maybe we weren't the ones choosing to go. Cass wanted to show us something. She didn't explain what it was over text. She just said she needed us to see it with our own eyes, that trying to describe it would sound crazy, that she'd rather show us. We arranged to meet the next day, at her place, in the afternoon. I arrived before Jonah. Cass opened the door with that contained energy of someone who's been holding on to information too long and has hit the limit of their restraint. There was fresh coffee in the kitchen, and she didn't offer any, which was strange. Cass offers coffee to everyone. It's reflex. It's automatic. We sat in the living room. She stayed standing. She put her phone on the table, screen up. She said she'd started doing this after that night, recording audio while she slept. Not every night. Only on the nights she woke up with that feeling that something had happened while she was sleeping, but she couldn't figure out what. She'd wake up with her heart pounding and no memory of anything. No dream, no image. Just that state of alert the body enters when it processes something the mind didn't register. She lived in a 2-story house. Bedroom in the back, window facing the yard, and her yard bordered the neighbor's yard, which bordered another yard, in a chain that eventually reached the street running parallel to the Briarwood property, not adjacent. There was a block and a half between her bedroom window and the school fence, far enough that under normal circumstances you wouldn't hear anything from the property. Jonah arrived while she was still laying out the context. He came in, sat down. She didn't backtrack. She picked up right where she was, as if he already knew enough to follow along. She opened the recording app on her phone, found the file she wanted, said it was from 4 nights ago. She hit play. The first 2 minutes were apartment silence. The kind that isn't real silence. There's the low electrical hum underneath, the intermittent air conditioning, a car passing far away, her breathing as she slept, steady, deep, nothing. Then there was a sound. I had to listen twice to be sure of what I was hearing. It was distant, filtered by distance and walls in the night air. But it was there, breathing. Heavy, slow, with that specific interval between each breath that I recognized before I wanted to recognize it. It lasted maybe 40 seconds in the recording. Then it stopped. After it stopped, in a gap of about 10 seconds of silence, there was a different sound. Closer, not from the window, from the direction of the window, but close enough to have been picked up more clearly by the phone's microphone sitting on the nightstand. The sound of weight on grass. Once, twice. A third time, lighter, like an adjustment of position. Then nothing. Cass stopped the recording. Jonah was staring at the phone with that expression I'd learned to recognize on him in these past few weeks. Not exactly fear, closer to someone running a calculation that keeps coming up impossible, and checking the numbers again before accepting the result. I asked if she'd looked out the window. She said no. She said the next morning she'd gone out to the yard, and that the grass near the back fence was flattened in 2 spots. Not torn, Not scratched. Flattened, the way it gets when something heavy stays in one place long enough to bend the grass without pulling it out. She said one of the back fence boards was displaced, not broken. Displaced, like something had pushed it slowly and then let it go. The three of us sat in silence for a while after that. It was Jonah who spoke first. He asked in that calm voice I no longer found reassuring, whether she'd checked if there were other recordings with that sound. Cass said there were. She picked the phone back up and went through the files. She'd recorded on several non-consecutive nights over the past few weeks. 4 of them had variations of the same sound, always in the middle of the night, always distant at first, one time closer than the others. In that closer one, the breathing was clear enough to have texture, if breathing can have texture. That wet weight of air moving through a large cavity, through large nostrils, through musculature that wasn't the musculature of any animal I knew. She hadn't shown it to anyone before us. I asked why not. She looked at me for a second. Then she said, because if I showed it to someone who wasn't there that night, they'd tell me it was a dog, that it was some random animal, that I was being paranoid, and I didn't want to hear that because I knew it wasn't true, and having someone tell me it was would make me doubt what I know I heard. There was nothing to say to that. She was right. We left her place as it was getting dark. On the sidewalk, before we split off, Cass said something quietly, almost to herself. She said, "It comes through here. We didn't go to it. It's the one coming to us." Jonah didn't respond. Neither did I. But on the way to my car, I started paying attention to things I normally wouldn't. The grass in the strip along the sidewalk, the bushes on the sides of houses, the pockets of shadow between parked cars. Looking for flattened, looking for displaced, looking for the kind of mark something heavy leaves when it passes through a place and moves on. I didn't find anything, but the fact that I'd looked said something in itself. That night I woke up to the apartment in absolute silence. Not the normal silence, that other kind, the one Patrice had described, the kind that happens when something large stops moving but hasn't gone away. I lay there without moving, breathing shallow, listening. Outside my bedroom window there was a gap between the building and the neighbor's wall, about 6 feet wide, where a dumpster and a gas meter sat. A place I never looked at, never thought about, existing only as background. I heard a weight settle into that space. Once. Slowly. I lay there staring at the ceiling. My heart was beating in a way I could feel in my throat. I counted to 30 without moving. There were no more sounds. I didn't get up to look out the window. I lay there until the sky outside started to lighten, and only then closed my eyes and didn't really sleep. Just that shallow thing the body does when it's exhausted but not relaxed. In the morning, I went to the window and looked down at the space below. The dumpster had been moved about 16 inches from the wall. It was heavy, metal, the kind that takes 2 people to shift. There was no wind that night. I didn't tell Jonah or Cass about the dumpster. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was more the kind of thing you don't say, because saying it would make it real in a different way, from already knowing. I already knew. I'd seen it with my own eyes that morning. Stood there staring at those 16 inches of space between the dumpster and the wall long enough to be certain I wasn't miscalculating, that it hadn't been that way the night before. I knew, but as long as I didn't say it out loud, it only existed inside my head, and inside my head I still had some control over what to do with it. I called Jonah in the morning to talk about something else, about Cass, about the recordings, about what we should do with that information. He picked up quickly, voice alert, like he hadn't slept much either. We talked for about 20 minutes without reaching any useful conclusion. In the end, he said he was going to try to track down Derek Sousa, the district inspector, that it might be worth talking to someone who was officially inspecting the property, someone who might have seen things we didn't have access to. I said I thought that was a good idea. I hung up and went to work. Derek Sousa wasn't hard to find. Jonah texted that same afternoon with a phone number. He'd caught the man on his way out of the field, introduced himself, vaguely explained that he was from the neighborhood and had a few questions about the inspection. Derek had been receptive enough to hand over his contact. I called that night. He answered in the voice of someone used to getting work calls after hours and not particularly enjoying it, but accepting it as part of the territory. I gave him my name. There was a small pause on the other end, not long, but noticeable. The kind that happens when someone recognizes a name they've heard in another context. He knew who I was. I didn't ask how. I let it go and got straight to it. Said I was one of the 3 who'd been on the field that night, that I'd seen something behind the shed, and that I wanted to know what he'd found during the inspection. Another pause. Longer this time. Then he said he wasn't authorized to share technical details of the inspection with people outside the district. He said it in a tone that was too correct, too rehearsed, the kind of line people use when they're repeating what they've been told to say and not necessarily what they think. I said I understood, but that I wasn't asking about an official report. I was asking what he'd seen with his own eyes. Longer silence, then he said, "Where are you right now?" I said I was at home. He said he'd call me from another number in 10 minutes. He hung up. Exactly 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a different number. His personal cell, not the one he'd given Jonah. I answered. His voice was different. Not exactly scared. More like someone who'd spent days trying to organize an experience into a framework that made sense, and still hadn't managed it. He said the inside of the shed had marks that didn't correspond to any maintenance tool, any type of vandalism he knew. That the marks on the interior walls were at inconsistent heights. Some near the ceiling, which meant whatever made them was either very tall or had been in a position that wasn't standing upright the way humans stand upright. That on the floor there was organic compaction that the district lab was analyzing, but that he, with his experience with decomposing materials, recognized as animal tissue in an advanced stage, pressed into the concrete with considerable weight and over considerable time. I made him stop there. I asked if he was saying the thing slept in there. He went quiet for a second. Then he said he wasn't saying anything officially, but that the pattern of use of the space he documented was consistent with a large animal using that shed as regular shelter. Not occasional, regular. I asked how long. He said there was no way to pinpoint it, but that the oldest marks he'd been able to identify in the structure had been made much longer ago than that night. That this hadn't started with us. I already knew that. Patrice had told me. But hearing it from someone who had measured and photographed and analyzed was different from hearing it from a neighbor on the sidewalk with grocery bags in her hands. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. He said he'd found remains. He didn't elaborate right away. He let the words sit there for a second, like he was deciding how much detail was necessary. Then he said that in the back of the shed, in an area of permanent shadow where natural light didn't reach, there was a concentration of organic material that included bone, fragmented, with pressure marks consistent with a bite force far beyond any documented regional predator. The lab was analyzing it, but he'd photographed it, and some of the pieces were identifiable to someone with experience in animal structure. I asked what was identifiable. He stayed silent long enough for me to understand he wasn't going to answer that question directly. He only said, "It wasn't deer. It wasn't wild boar. It wasn't any animal that belongs on that property." The call went quiet for a moment. Outside my apartment, a car rolled by slowly with loud music, that bass you feel in your chest before you hear it, and it passed and the silence came back. I asked what he was going to do with what he'd found. He said he'd be submitting his report to the district, and the district would do what the district does, which in his experience meant file it, postpone it, and eventually demolish the space without adequate public explanation. He said it without bitterness, just as a description of process, like someone who'd watched that cycle play out before and stopped being surprised by it. Before he hung up, he said, "You should stop going there." I said I hadn't been there recently. He said, "I know, but you will." He hung up before I could respond. I sat there holding my phone in the dark of my living room, the apartment quiet around me, thinking about the way he'd said that, not as a warning, as a prediction, with the same flat certainty of someone who's looked at a pattern long enough to know how it ends, and thinking that he was probably right, that I would go back, that something in that story hadn't finished happening yet, and that this unfinished part had my name written into it in a way I hadn't chosen, but that was there all the same. The question wasn't whether I was going back, it was what I was going to find when I did. I went back on a morning with a light fog. Not in the middle of the night, not at night. In the morning with gray light and that humidity Kannapolis gets at certain times of year when the air feels thicker than usual, like the whole city is breathing slowly. I figured morning would be different. I figured the light, even if weak, would change something. It didn't. I didn't tell Jonah. Didn't tell Cass. I remembered what Derek had said. You will. And I went as if the prediction had already removed the possibility of choice from me. Maybe that's what it was. Maybe I just needed someone to tell me it was inevitable so I could stop pretending I was still deciding. I parked on the same street, on the same shoulder. The orange caution tape had been taken down. The cones were gone. The field was the same as it had always been. Abandoned, wet, quiet. The entrance was unlocked, the padlock the district had put on hanging open on the chain, like someone had forgotten to close it on the way out, or had left too quickly to care. I pushed the gate open and walked in. The grass soaked through my sneakers in the first 10 yards. The field in the morning light had a different quality than at night. Not less unsettling, just unsettling in a different way. At night the fear came from what I couldn't see. In the morning it came from what I could see too clearly. The grass too tall. The bleacher concrete with that dark moisture that never dried out. The rusted light poles that would never come on again. A place that stopped and stayed stopped, while time kept passing around it. I walked toward the inner fence. The bent section was still there, the same gap as always. I went through to the other side. The back area was quiet. Thicker fog here, trapped between the back wall and the tree line, that dense vegetation that starts where the concrete ends. The shed to my left, door ajar, not wide open, just ajar. That specific angle I'd already seen before from the car window. I stood still for a moment, listening. Just the sound of water dripping from a broken gutter on the shed roof. Steady dripping onto wet concrete, with that metronomic interval that starts to seem intentional after you've been listening long enough. I took 2 steps toward the shed. That's when I heard the breathing. It wasn't coming from the shed. It was coming from the tree line to my right. From the dense vegetation where the fog was thickest, where the morning light didn't reach with any depth. Heavy breathing, with that long, wet interval I knew from Cass's recordings. But the recordings had the filter of distance, the dampening of walls and air and city blocks. Here there was no filter. It was less than 15 yards away. I didn't move. Part of my brain was running calculations with a coldness I didn't know I had. Distance to the inner fence. Time to get through the gap, distance to the front gate, time to the gate. Another part was simply present, registering everything with that strange clarity that comes when fear passes a certain level and becomes something else on the other side, something that doesn't have a good name. The movement in the vegetation was slow, not a lunge, not a charge. A gradual shift, like something very large was repositioning itself with a patience that had no need to hurry. The vegetation moved at non-consecutive points, here, then there, then a spot further left, as if the creature was moving laterally inside the tree line without coming out yet. Then it came out. Not all at once. First an arm, too long, the elbow joint at a position that made the forearm point downward at an angle a human arm doesn't make, claws touching the ground despite the body still being upright. Then the shoulder, that wrong width I'd seen from behind months ago, and that from the front, from almost the front, from 3/4, was different, was worse, because from behind I could tell myself it was shadow and angle and my own perception distorted by fear. From the front there was no way to tell myself that. The fur was exactly as I remembered, sparse in irregular tufts with the grayish skin visible between them, stretched over a bone structure that didn't follow any proportions I knew. The neck was too long. The head was tilted slightly to one side, not toward me, toward a point to my left, as if it was calculating something that wasn't my position, but rather the space around me. The eyes caught the weak morning light and gave it back. They weren't red. They were a color I can't name precisely. Dirty amber maybe, or yellow with gray underneath. But what stayed with me wasn't the color, it was the size. And it was the placement, set slightly wider apart than human eyes, which gave the face that geometry that doesn't match any mental file I had. The muzzle was wet, wide nostrils, open, moving with that breathing I'd been hearing for weeks on recordings and was now hearing live, without filter, with texture. We stayed like that. I don't know how long. It might have been 20 seconds. It might have been 2 minutes. Time does a strange thing when you're looking at something that shouldn't exist, and that's looking back at you. It doesn't collapse or expand. It just stops being a useful measure. The creature didn't advance. It stood at the edge of the vegetation, that long arm touching the ground, head tilted, looking at me in a way I can't call assessment because assessment implies reasoning, and I don't know if that's what it was. But there was something in the way it held itself still that wasn't random. It wasn't the stillness of a confused animal. It was something else. I took a step back. It didn't move. I took another step, then another. I kept my face pointed toward it, walking backward until I felt the inner fence behind me. I went through the gap without taking my eyes off it. On the other side of the fence, I kept walking backward for another 10 yards before turning and walking quickly toward the gate. I didn't run. I don't know why. Something told me that running was the mistake, that running was the movement that turned one thing into another thing, and I didn't want to find out what the other thing was. I went out through the gate, crossed the street, got to my car. My hand was trembling when I tried to put the key in the ignition. Not the visible, exaggerated kind. Just that fine internal tremor of a muscle that's been clenched too long and doesn't know how to stop. I started the car. In the rearview mirror, the field gate was open, the entrance empty, the fog covering the field beyond. Nothing followed me. I drove away on Hawaii 29 with the radio off and my hand steady on the wheel. And the smell, that smell, open flesh and metal and wet heat, caught in my clothes, in my hair, in the back of my throat in a way I knew wasn't going to leave quickly. It took 3 rounds in the wash to get it out. I called Jonah from the parking lot of a gas station on Y29 because I couldn't drive more than a mile without needing to stop. I wasn't hurt. There was nothing physical, no scratches, no fall, no contact. But my body hadn't gotten that memo and was doing what it wanted, which was shaking uncontrollably in the driver's seat of a car parked at a gas pump while an attendant cleaned the windshield of the car next to mine without looking at me once. Jonah picked up on the second ring. I told him where I was. I told him I'd gone to the field. I told him I'd seen the creature. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said he was leaving right now and to stay where I was. I hung up and sat there staring at the dashboard. There was a small sticker near the odometer, a yellow circle with a smiley face, the kind kids get at the doctor's office. It wasn't my new car, I'd bought it used and the sticker was already there when I took the vehicle. I'd never removed it because it was in a position I didn't look at while driving. I sat there staring at that smiley face for about 3 minutes while I waited for Jonah. He arrived in 18 minutes, parked next to me, got into my car through the passenger door without asking, closed the door. I told him everything. The fog, the unlocked gate, the breathing before I saw it, the arm coming out of the vegetation, the eyes, the wet muzzle, the fact that I'd walked backward and the creature hadn't moved. I told it with a linearity that surprised me. I'd expected it to come out fragmented, out of order, but it came out straight, as if the sequence of events had been recorded with a sharpness that ordinary memory doesn't usually have. Jonah listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he sat there looking through the windshield. A truck pulled into the station, and the sound of the diesel engine filled the car for a few seconds before it emptied out again. Then he said, "It didn't come after you." It wasn't a question, it was the same observation he'd made about himself after going to the shed alone. He said it the same way, not as relief, as a data point. I said no. He said, "It didn't come after me when I went. It didn't come after you just now. It stood there and watched." I said, "Yeah." He turned to face me. He said, "Riley, this is its second encounter with you. You were the first one it saw that night. You were the one who got closest to it. You smelled it, heard it, stood 2 yards away without it noticing. and now you came back and stood in front of it long enough for it to see you completely. I made him stop. I asked what he was saying. He said he didn't know what he was saying, that he was thinking out loud, but that there was a pattern in how the creature didn't react to human presence the way a predator reacts when it's surprised or when it's hungry, that it stayed still, that it watched, that afterward it didn't do anything. I said maybe it just wasn't hungry when we showed up. He said maybe, but that the remains Derek had found in the shed suggested it ate regularly, that it wasn't a question of opportunity. I stayed quiet. Then he said the thing I hadn't been able to put into words, but that had been sitting there since I left the field. He said, "What if it's already known exactly where you are for quite some time? What if that night wasn't you finding it, but it letting you find it?" The gas station had an outdoor speaker playing an old country radio station, the kind with pedal steel, and the sound came through the car windows in a muffled way. There was something absurd about hearing pedal steel while processing that sentence. I sat there thinking about that, instead of thinking about the sentence, which is exactly the kind of thing my brain does when it receives information it doesn't want to process. I called Derek Souza that same afternoon. He answered in his work voice. When I said my name, the voice shifted. Not much, just a small adjustment, the kind that happens when someone was expecting a call but not necessarily this soon. I told him I'd gone back to the field, that I'd seen the creature face to face. Short silence. Then he said, "Are you okay?" I said I was. He said the final inspection report had been submitted to the district the previous week, that the official recommendation was accelerated demolition of the shed and a wildlife survey of the surrounding area by a state specialist team, that the district had received the report, formally acknowledged it, and that as of now, neither of the two recommendations had been acted on. I asked what the report said about the remains he'd found. He went quiet for a moment. Then he said the official report described the remains as likely belonging to unidentified regional wildlife, that the lab analysis had been inconclusive due to degradation of the material, that this was the version that existed on paper. I asked what the version was that didn't exist on paper. He said, 2 of the fragments had morphology consistent with a human hand, distal phalanges, joint structure, degraded but identifiable to someone who knows what they're looking at. Those 2 fragments didn't appear in the final report. I didn't say anything. He said he'd forwarded photographic copies to a personal contact outside the district, someone with the right background to provide a second opinion, and that he was waiting to hear back. Said he'd let me know if there were any updates. Before hanging up, he said, "Riley, stop going there." I said I knew. He said, "No, you don't. You went knowing you shouldn't. That's different." He hung up. I sat in the car for a while after that. The smiley face sticker was still on the dashboard. The station was busy. Cars pulling in, pulling out, people filling up with that automatic efficiency of someone who does the same thing every week without thinking. I thought about the fragments that hadn't made it into the report. I thought about the question from the anonymous text. Did you see what it was eating? I thought that maybe the person who sent that message already knew the answer, that maybe they'd sent the question not to find out, but to see if I knew, to see how much I'd seen that night before I turned and walked away. I started the car. I took the long way home, the route that doesn't pass Briarwood, and I noticed the fact that I'd chosen the longer route, that it had been automatic, that my body was already avoiding certain roads without me having to think about it, which didn't solve anything, because the creature didn't need me to come to it. That was a while ago. I won't say how long. I've learned that counting time creates an illusion of distance that doesn't actually exist. You say 6 months, and it sounds like there's a separation, a layer of past between you and the thing, when in reality the separation isn't temporal. Or it isn't only temporal. Briarwood is still there. The demolition Derek recommended never happened. I drove down the street once by accident, genuinely by accident this time, and the orange tape was back. New, pulled tighter, with a small district sign that said, "Evaluation in progress." The sign looked recent. The field behind it looked exactly the same as always. I didn't stop the car. Jonah moved away. Not far. He went to Concord, which is 15 minutes from Kannapolis, a distance that in any other context would be irrelevant. He said he'd found a better apartment for the same price, that it made financial sense, that it was time to leave the neighborhood anyway. He said all of that in that calm voice of his, and I didn't question a single word because the words were plausible, and because I understood what was underneath them without needing to name it. We still talk. Less than before, but we talk. There are subjects we avoid without arranging it. No explicit agreement. No conversation about what can and can't be said. Certain subjects just stopped coming up and neither of us pushed. Cass deleted the recordings. She told me in a direct message without context on an ordinary day. Said she'd deleted everything, that she'd bought a new sound system for her bedroom that she kept running all night, and that she was fine. I asked if she wanted to talk. She said no, that deleting had been the talking, that there was nothing left to say about it. I didn't push, but I think about those recordings sometimes, about the sound of heavy breathing picked up by a phone's microphone a block and a half away, about the flattened grass marks she found in the morning, about the fact that deleting the file doesn't erase what the file recorded, that the sound existed regardless of whether there was a file preserving it, that the creature passed through her yard that night regardless of whether anyone documented it. Deleting doesn't undo. Derek Sousa called me once after our last conversation, said his contact had confirmed the analysis of the fragments, that they were human, that he'd forwarded that information to an authority above the district. He didn't say which, and that he'd been formally instructed not to discuss the matter while the investigation was ongoing. I asked if there was a real investigation, or if investigation in progress was how filing it away was described when there were eyes watching. He went quiet for a moment. Then he said he didn't know, that he hoped it was real, that he'd keep following up. We haven't spoken since. I keep thinking about the message. Did you see what it was eating? I still don't know who sent it. The number stays out of service. Sometimes I imagine it was someone who had also been on that field at some point before us, someone who had seen before we did, and was carrying the same unanswered question, someone who needed to know if I'd gotten further than they had the night I went to get the ball. I hadn't. I turned away before seeing. But now I know enough about what was on the floor of that shed to fill in the space that the lack of vision left blank. And it's not better than having seen. It's different. Maybe it's worse. The imagination doesn't have the limits that vision has. It doesn't stop at the real detail. It goes further, goes deep, goes to places that a second of phone light would never have illuminated. I'm still living in the same apartment. The dumpster in the gap between the buildings is back against the wall. I don't know if someone pushed it back, or if it was the wind, or if there's an explanation that doesn't involve either of those things. I don't go down to look closely. I look from the window, check the position, and go on with my day. I sleep with sound on now. Not the sound system Cass bought, just the fan on the highest setting, that constant white noise that fills the silence before the silence can turn into something else. It works most nights. What changed isn't the fear. The fear I've learned to carry. It becomes familiar weight after enough time. It doesn't disappear, but it takes up a fixed place. It stops being a surprise. What changed is something else, harder to name. It's the fact that the creature has been close to me more than once and hasn't done anything. It was in the field that night, when I turned and walked backward to the fence. It was in the space below my window. The displaced dumpster is my evidence for that. It was 15 yards away from me on the foggy morning and stood there watching me until I left. And it didn't do anything. Jonah said, "What if it's already known exactly where you are for quite some time?" I think about that with a regularity that isn't healthy, and that I also can't control. I think about it at the grocery store, at work, in the car. I think about it when I wake up in the middle of the night with the apartment too quiet even with the fan running. I think about it whenever I pass any abandoned property anywhere in the city, and my eyes automatically go to the vegetation line at the back, to the shadows between structures, to the spaces where something large could be standing still and quiet and invisible to anyone who didn't know to look. I know to look now. And what I've learned through all of this is that knowing to look isn't protection. It's just a different way of carrying the same thing. The creature knows where I am. I know where it is. For now, that seems to be enough for neither of us to act for now.